So this gets us into representational systems because that's what all of this is based on. We talk about visual eye accessing cues. We're looking around to see how someone's thinking about what they're thinking about, how they're thinking about it. We are tapping into representational systems. And the representational system really has to do with three main ways of looking at people. We look at them as auditory, meaning they relate primarily to hearing. We look at them as visual, meaning they relate primarily to things they can see. Or we look at them as kinesthetic, meaning they relate primarily to feelings. Remember, emotional feelings or motion or feelings on their skin and so forth. So it's important to understand, and I always emphasize this with students, that we are not categorizing people as only that. If we were to say that someone is only visual, we might think that they only relate to the visual world. Well, that doesn't really make any sense, because if they're still able to hear and they're still able to move and feel things on their skin and feel emotions, then they're obviously relating to the other senses as well. If we say someone's auditory and we just write them off as being auditory, well, if they're still able to see and still able to feel, then they're not just auditory, but we say that people are primarily visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. So keep that important distinction in mind. We're talking about the primary representational system that they use to relate to their environment. We're not saying that it's the only way they do that. So let's take a look at these three, because I think you're going to find that it's very fascinating when you start paying attention to people and how they interact with their worlds. First of all, if you talk to someone who's visual, you're going to notice that they take a lot of fast breaths, a lot of breathing rather shallowly. This isn't always the case, but in many cases, in many instances, you're going to find out that it is true, that they breathe shallowly and quickly. Also, visual people like to point. And when they do point, it's not a casual point, it's like that. Because they're pointing at what they're seeing. So it's very important for them to get your attention on that also, or focus themselves visually on it. So they are pointing at something. They like to use a lot of visual words. I see what you mean. Okay? Do you see what I mean? They like to use pictures. They like to say, look at this. They like to say, does this look clear to you? And so forth. They use words that have to do with vision. Now, in your workbook, in the printed part of this program, you have words that visual people use. So I want you to realize that the visual representational system is the representational system often used by men. Men tend to favor the visual system. In fact, if we were to look at all three of them, most people in general, the majority of people, use this representational system primarily. But it's also heavily weighted toward men. It's also the representational system of business. But interestingly enough, the super successful in business tend to use a kinesthetic representational system. So whereas visual is the most common representational system in the business world and will certainly get you by, kinesthetic is what the leaders tend to use. So let's look at that next. Let's look at kinesthetic. A kinesthetic person is going to breathe a little more deeply. They're taking time. They actually seem to enjoy the breath. Whereas a visual person might be breathing because they have to breathe just to get it out of the way and to get to their visual point, a kinesthetic person actually is in tune with all that. They really feel the breath. They really enjoy the process. Kinesthetic people seem to be more about processes. So the speaking is also a little more slow because of this. Speaking more slowly. They're enjoying the movement of their mouths, the slow interaction. They're enjoying all of that. Now, as you can imagine, when a visual person meets a kinesthetic person, it's not very pretty. The situation is usually something like this. The visual person is talking quickly and pointing and so forth, and the kinesthetic person is breathing slowly and looking at the visual person as if to say, what's wrong with that person? What? They need to slow down. They're overloading me. They're coming at me too quickly. There's too much information, and this pointing thing's got to stop. So a visual person meeting a kinesthetic person, there's probably not going to be a wonderful rapport. So this is why you need to understand these systems, so that if you have a kinesthetic person sitting in your chair as a client or someone you want to work with, an NLP, and you're a visual person, well, if you want them to come back, you're going to have to talk their language. They are not interested in you pointing and breathing shallowly and speaking quickly and talking about things you can see. They want to take time. They want to get to know you. They want to slow down. They also tend to be overweight because food is a very kinesthetic experience. So slow down if you're talking to a kinesthetic person. If you're a kinesthetic person, you're dealing with a visual person, then maybe it goes a little bit against your grain to speed up quite that much and to be so seemingly overly aggressive as to point and so forth. But at least you can use the language of the visual person. You can start talking about things that they can see rather than things that they can feel. They may not be interested in hearing about the culinary delights that you engaged in this week, but they may be interested in hearing about the museum you went to and what you saw there. So keep these things in mind. Let's talk about auditory people. Auditory people. Auditory people tend to primarily look from side to side because when they think about something, whether they're creating it or remembering it, they are creating or remembering the sounds. Okay, so kinesthetic people will be looking down. Visual people would be mostly looking up. This doesn't happen all the time, but mostly that's where you'll find these people looking because that's the way they encode information. That's the way they access information. But auditory people are looking side to side. And they're saying things like, I hear what you're saying, or listen to me, or let's talk things out. They also tend to talk rhythmically, not quite that profoundly, not quite that clearly as to be a very detectable rhythm, but there tends to be a rhythm in their voices. There tends to be a pattern that you can hear. So again, it's not usually that clear as I'm doing an example, but if you pay attention, you're going to find that auditory people are so in tune with sounds that they really respect sounds and they relate to sounds. And they want the sounds that are coming out of them to be sounds that make sense, sounds that are rhythmic. You know, a musician wouldn't necessarily just want to make an awful or strange sound with a guitar if they were a guitarist. Now some do, and they do that on purpose, but there's usually a point to it. There's usually some sort of message they're relaying. They respect the fact that they're using their instrument to get across some form of communication. So whereas a person who is a musician would communicate with sound in one way, a way that would be pleasing, usually, a person who is not a musician may not respect sound as much, so they may not care as much about sound. So if they were to put together a presentation, sound might not figure in so prominently. So keep in mind the visual representational systems as you work with clients and as you analyze yourself so that you will be better able to interact with your environment. Let's talk about predicates. Predicates are words that aren't necessarily visual or auditory or kinesthetic. They're words that when the person hears them, they can make their own. And I'm talking about words such as think. You hear the word think. That can be visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. The word clear. If something's clear, it can be clear in a visual sense, in an auditory sense, or a kinesthetic sense. Fuzzy, the opposite of clear. It can be fuzzy in an auditory sense, kinesthetic sense, or a visual sense. So if you want to use words that everyone can relate to, then use predicates. Predicates are words that people take and they just internalize it and they make it theirs. I want to share with you a story of working with a patient. I had a patient when I was in Beverly Hills who came to me because the therapist who had been working with her wasn't able to get anywhere. And this was a psychologist who was working with this patient, wasn't able to get anywhere. And one of the reasons that I found out was that the psychologist just didn't understand the representational systems. So whereas the patient, I found out right away, was using words that meant to me that she was feeling her environment or sensing her environment in a visual way, the therapist wasn't picking up on that. The therapist was just listening to what she was saying and sometimes how she was saying it, but not really trying to categorize the patient based on a representational system. So when I was able to do that, to categorize her, I was able to tell her things such as, I want you to look into the future and see yourself having lost the amount of weight you no longer want or need. I was able to use words like that, not even in a hypnosis session necessarily, because as you probably know, I'm a hypnotherapist as well, but just in a conversational setting. I was able to use NLP in a conversational way. And by the way, that's one of the most beautiful things about NLP. Hypnosis is not required. You can just have a normal conversation with someone and change their minds, change their way of thinking about things. So by using visual words, I was able to relate to her and start her along her path of weight loss. And we had tremendous success. So keep in mind how powerful this technology is, how powerful the information is, and how important visual, kinesthetic, and auditory are when you're talking to someone. You want to speak their language. Otherwise, you may be speaking a foreign language and not realize it.